Welcome back to the Brave Traveler podcast. For fans of the supernatural, tales of fantasy and adventure, and stories of creatures mythological. Thank you for putting up with my narrator's accent. The truth is, I couldn't deal with my own voice. To get through the reading, I needed something more expressive and colorful. I wanted to hire the great Max McLean, but it turns out I'm a heck of a lot cheaper. If you like this content, please subscribe, be sure to share it with others, and give a thumbs up. I'm glad you're here, and thank you for listening. Now let's pick up where we left off. Episode 5, Majesty The Sorcerer and the Saint. Chapter 3, Before Gelzuin's Throne. The statue of the bear was perfect to the finest detail. From the rough stone texture of its fur to its smooth, polished claws that glistened in the dim light. Had it been carved by a master sculptor, it would have been a work of art. But this was a frightful work of magic, and Katie could only stare at the lifeless creature standing before her. Still, for all her fear, there was something hauntingly peaceful about the thing. It was covered in a light frost that sparkled like diamond dust. Katie summoned her courage. She reached out and touched the icy surface, then pulled back her hand and whispered, "What have you done?" The wizard looked down and smiled as he admired his own handiwork. "I like my subjects a little more soft-spoken. Remember that, child. It will serve you well." Suddenly he paused to glance around the room, then turned to Katie with a look of surprise. "My dear, it seems you have forgotten something." Katie looked around her. "It seems you've misplaced your guardian." "I'm afraid that was not very wise. The Norworld is a very dangerous place, especially for a human child. You really should have one, you know. A guardian, that is." The wizard mocked her with a look of concern. "Don't worry. The challenge will not go unanswered. It's all part of the plan," he said with a fiendish grin, then sat back in the shadows and waited. In a distant land known as Paradise, where angels guard the 12 gates of heaven and towering mansions pierce the clouds, the heavenly host was assembled and the army of God stood ready. Glistening warriors gathered together to see who among them would be chosen to rescue the child that had been spirited away into darkness. The archangel Michael stood like a general before the assembly. There were seraphim and cherubim, the angel Gabriel, Azrael, the mighty Uriel, and 1,000 gilded warriors ready to heed the call. Then from the heavenly throne came a beam of light that shone down upon a lone warrior, an angel with the heart of a lion. The mighty guardian stepped forward from among the ranks and knelt to receive the assignment from God. In an instant, a brilliant ray burst forth from the hallowed halls and shot into the sky above the star-spangled realm. It whistled from one end of the great expanse to the other in the twinkling of an eye. At the leading edge of that brilliant ray was the mighty soldier of God rocketing forward at speeds unimaginable, trailing fire for 100 miles. The angel plunged downward, forging through the clouds like a fiery comet, and looked to the world below. Soon he was skimming the treetops, his eyes like living lanterns searching the dark land as he approached. And thus God's wrath descended swiftly in the form of an angel, a rod of iron, the measure of truth, the instrument of justice, that was known as Stadia. Katie stood next to the stone bear, and the creatures in the dark throne room stared at what remained of their goodly king. They all feared the wizard and his power, and kept their murmurings to themselves, all except one. The light flashed out of the darkness and rose above the crowd, shimmering brightly. It dropped down and darted around the bear, then hovered over his head, fluttering on sparkling wings. Katie shied away from the golden light until it held still long enough for her to see, then stared in wonder. The little fairy was barely 2 inches tall and glistened like a star. Yet for one so small, her tiny voice caught everyone's attention. Kitch cried out in anger.
"You monster! A pox upon your lot! You double-dabbed monster! How could you?"
she yelled. Gilzuin turned aside in disgust. "I hate fairies," he said, looking toward the wall.
"That's because you have no power over us, you beast! If I could, I'd cast you into the lake of fire myself!"
Gilzuin's eyes glowed like red-hot coals as he glared at the fairy and growled. "It will take more than you, my dear Kitch. Far more than you." The glowing fairy was full of fire, and bold as she could be as she hovered over the stone bear, her tiny wings a blur. Katy gazed at the little creature when suddenly the throne room doors burst open. Before Katy could turn around, Rogad and the other ogre came tumbling in and rolled across the stone floor until they were sprawled out flat on their faces. The two monsters laid there groaning and were either unwilling or unable to stand. Gilzuin and all the dark creatures looked to see what had happened when a loud voice echoed across the hall. "Fear not!" The words rang through the dark chamber as a tall figure of a man strode into the throne room. A long gray cloak flowed around him. It draped all the way to the floor and fully covered his brilliant armor. A gilded helmet of silver and gold was upon his head and had a luster that glowed brightly. The angel was not as big as the one that Katy had left behind, but he was a soldier and more powerful. Although his wings remained invisible, the warrior angel was dressed for battle, and as he came forward and removed his helmet, Katy could see his was a face etched by the hand of God. His eyes glistened like sapphire. His hair shimmered like spun gold and flowed about his shoulders. The angel was beautiful and strong. With just one look, Katy was lost in his perfect countenance and knew that he was her defender. The wizard, however, was not as impressed, and nestled himself in the comfort of his throne. "Speak of the angel," Gilzuin said. The golden-haired stranger approached with his helmet tucked under his arm, and as he drew nearer, a sense of peace rose within Katy that told her who and what he was. When he finally stood before her, Katy tilted her head back till she was nearly looking straight up. "You're an angel, aren't you?" she said. "Indeed I am, child of God," he answered softly. "I am Stadia. Are you all right?" Katy loved the warmth of his voice and smiled till her eyes nearly shut. "I am now," she said. "I am now." Suddenly Gilzuin's eyes turned black as coal, and the wizard jumped to his feet upon hearing the angel's name. "What's this?" The creatures in attendance pulled back even further. "Where is the archangel? Where is Michael?" Stadia smiled down on Katy and only gave the wizard a casual glance. "This is an outrage! Speak to me, minion! Answer me!" Gilzuin demanded. Stadia took his time as he turned to face the wizard with a long, slow gaze. "Spare yourself. Your threats are meaningless. If it were not for Almighty God who has sent me, I would have no need to grace you with an answer. The archangel is about his business. That is all you need to know." Gilzuin shook with rage. His black eyes bulged as his face turned red, then a darker shade of purple. Katy squinted and took a few steps back, afraid he might actually pop. Then, as quickly as he had been arisen to anger, the wizard suddenly became calm again. When he returned to normal, he took a deep breath and forced a smile. "You're trying to bait me, aren't you? Very clever indeed." The wizard looked the angel up and down. "Perhaps I shall have great sport toying with you after all, and when I have done, your lord shall think better next time and send me a real challenge." The angel smiled. "I shall do my best not to disappoint you," he said, then turned his attention to the statue of the bear. "This is your handiwork, is it not? Return the bear now." The fairy Kitch flew near the angel and yelled out,
Yes, yes! Return him back, you wicked toad!
Gelzuin leaned forward and glared at the fairy, who quickly darted behind the angel and peeked out over his shoulder.
You heard him,
she added boldly. The angel locked eyes with the wizard. It was a direct challenge, and all the creatures in attendance watched eagerly to see what would happen next. A few moments later, the wizard simply sat back on his throne and smiled. Of course, as you wish, the wizard said slyly. With a flick of his wrist, stone turned back to flesh and fur. The bear was back, and Bronwyn's booming voice echoed throughout the chamber as he finished the sentence he had started just before the spell had been placed upon him.
I will not allow you to harm this child of God. Do you hear? As long as there is breath within me, I will fight you.
Everyone smiled at the bear, who was completely unaware of what had happened. Just then, Bronwyn turned to see the angel with a look of surprise, and Stadia smiled down on him. Fear not, dear king. The favor of God is upon you. I have come to help. Bronwyn bowed before the angel, humbled by his presence.
The Lord is merciful. Angel of God, you are most welcomed.
Bronwyn rose and quickly took the opportunity to plead his case against the wizard.
This creature has taken control of my kingdom. With the use of magic, the ogres and his evil horde, he has turned our land into a place of darkness. Though he has promised to leave here once he has found what he is looking for, there is no truth in him. I trust him not.
Suddenly, a little man stepped forward, barely 4 feet tall. His bright red beard and dark brown eyes shimmered in the torchlight as he thrust his fist into the air. "Hear, hear!" yelled Gogarth, leader of the dwarf people. Gogarth was rugged, his skin as tan as leather, his hands as big as oven mitts. The dwarf was dressed in rawhide and wore high boots with a thick leather belt that held a short sword strapped to his side. Others yelled their approval as another dwarf stepped forward, plump as a dumpling with a face as round as a pan. His clothes were made of the finest elk yarn and were neatly tailored. This was Gimble, and Katy liked him the moment she saw him. He nodded at her and doffed his large rakish hat, which had a big white feather tucked in its brim. Other dwarfs rallied behind the angel as well, then more and more, until all of the woodland creatures and the king's loyal subjects were cheering as one. The darker creatures, ogres and goblins alike, sneered and rattled their weapons, and in the midst of the uproar, the wizard finally raised his hands. "Wait! Hear me! Hear me!" he shouted. "The bear has spoken correctly. I have no quarrel with you, dwarves, elves, woodlanders, any of you. As soon as I have found that which I seek, I swear by the fiery tongue of the Gullock, I shall leave this place." Stadia's eyes narrowed as he spoke. "And what is this thing which you seek?" he asked. The wizard paused, and every living creature leaned forward, waiting to hear the answer, and would have gladly given the wizard whatever he wanted to make him go away. "I seek the white horse known as Majesty." The wizard called out in a loud voice for all to hear. At first there was silence, then Katy could hear the name repeated softly over and over again.
Majesty, Majesty,
He seeks the white horse.
Majesty,
Majesty.
The word spread throughout the chamber until everyone was staring anxiously. Katy was a little shocked herself. She found it peculiar that they all seemed to know about the white horse. After all, that's how she'd come to be here. She was chasing what she thought was a white horse, and now it just so happened that this wizard was looking for a white horse as well. Katy suddenly felt a knot in her stomach and suspected the answer to the mystery would not be a pleasant one. The crowd was still murmuring and seething anxiously when there came the tiny sound of laughter. The fairy flew out from behind the angel, and the goblin and ogres gave curious glances. Kitch laughed so hard she bobbed like a feather on the air until she came to rest on the great bear's back. The tiny creature rolled around in Bronwyn's fur, kicking her feet and beating her fists, then held her belly, unable to control her laughter. When she finally sat up, she looked at the wizard with a chuckle and a snort, then burst out laughing again. Bronwyn looked back to see the fairy slip off of his shoulder with her wings aflutter and plop down onto the floor next to him. Katy couldn't help herself and smiled as she came closer and stooped down. "What's so funny?" she asked, and had to wait a while for the fairy to settle down again. Kitch took a deep breath and finally climbed to her feet, exhausted. She looked up into Katy's big brown eyes and said,
The wizard is wasting his time. Everybody knows that no one knows where the white horse is."
The wizard smiled cleverly and pointed at Katy. "Then this child, my dear fairy, is that no one of whom you speak, for she knows far more than you think." Kitch stopped smiling. It was an absurd statement. The angel Stadia turned to look at the little girl, then King Bronwyn, then Gogarth and Gimble, and suddenly everyone in the chamber was looking at the little human child. Katy stood there, scratching her leg and squinting, which is what she did when she didn't know what to do. She had no idea what the wizard was talking about, and could only think of one thing to say. "I want to go home," she whined. The word home, home, home echoed throughout the chamber as all the creatures pondered what the wizard had said. It was obvious from Katy's expression that she didn't appear to know anything, but the wizard seemed quite certain of his claim. Stadia stepped forward. "Wizard, I know not what scheme you have laid out before you, but I know this: it will not involve this innocent child. You will deal with me directly." Gelzuin looked down from his throne. "You are of no concern to me, angel. My interest is in your master. I seek to defeat the Lord of Glory himself." With that, every creature in the throne room gasped. One dwarf suddenly fainted, another screamed, while others stumbled and pushed their way out of the chamber, fearing a lightning bolt would surely burst through the ceiling and strike them all dead.
"Blasphemer!"
King Bronwyn roared. Kitch darted behind the angel again, while others stood trembling. Gelzuin narrowed his eyes, then leant forward and glared. "I will not only defeat the Lord of Glory, but I will use this child to do it, and there is nothing you can do to stop me." Hearing that, Stadia advanced on the wizard and marched up the stone steps, when Gelzuin called out, "Careful, angel, lest you jeopardize this innocent child of God." Stadia glared back.
"You have no power over her. She is under my protection,"
he insisted. The wizard sighed. "Ah, yes. But what of her brother? Her dear, non-believing brother? What protection do you offer him?" "What does he mean?" Katy said. "What about my brother?" "Yes, such a problem. What to do? It appears that your brother's lack of faith has put him out, so to speak, and your mighty angel here is powerless to help him. I wonder where the boy is now. I certainly hope he is safe," Gelzuin said, and smiled. Stadia backed away from the wizard, and Katy rushed up beside him. I don't understand. What does he mean?" she asked, gazing up at the angel. Stadia frowned and looked down as though he were trying to figure out his next move. A moment later he turned to Katy. "I must go," he said. "No! You can't leave me here. Take me with you," she pleaded. Stadia stooped down and put his hand on her shoulder. "I dare not take you away. Our Lord has allowed this to happen for a reason, and when I return, we will find the answer together. Till then, there is nothing to fear." you will hardly know that I have gone." As Stadia spoke, Katy looked at the wizard and his goblin and all the horrible creatures that surrounded the throne. "You will be safe as long as you do not speak to the wizard. He is very clever, but say nothing to him. Do not talk to him until I return. Say nothing at all. Is that clear?" Katy felt a little braver and nodded her head. Just then the tiny fairy zipped through the air quick as a spark and landed on Katy's shoulder.
Don't worry. I'll be with her the whole time. She won't say a word.
Kitch saluted the angel like a proud little soldier, and King Bronwyn came alongside to add a word of reassurance.
"We will protect her until your return."
Stadia stood to his feet, nodded to the bear and the fairy, then looked to the wizard. "If you harm so much as a single hair on her head, I will grind your bones to dust." The wizard bowed politely to acknowledge the threat. With that, the angel turned, his long gray cloak billowing behind him, and left the chamber. As soon as he was gone, Rogad slammed the door shut behind him. The ogre looked at Slag, who was still sprawled out on the floor next to him, then rubbed his aching chin and bared his jagged teeth. As far as he was concerned, the little girl had become far more trouble than she was worth. Katy turned to face the wizard, and whatever courage she had quickly left her. Gelzuin smiled down from his throne with the hideous goblin by his side. Behind them, 100 yellow eyes glared out of the darkness.
"It's all right, child,"
Bronwyn said, sensing her fear. With that, Katy wrapped her arms around his neck, which was a lot like hugging a bus, and buried her face in his thick fur. The shimmering fairy fluttered just above to offer a little more light, and standing there, lost in a dark world, Katy thanked God for her new-found friends. Chapter 5. Baithenwar. Jack was fast asleep, and although his room was dark and silent, his dream was filled with fire and magic. For in his dream, he was a powerful wizard. The evening mist settled within the hills, and the high tower of Castle Baithenwar glistened in the moonlight. A shadow descended silently along the tower wall as a cloaked figure came to rest on the balcony. Jack peered down with his hair matted and sweat pouring from his brow, while far below, where the stone bridge met the castle wall, 2 red eyes glistened in the dark. Ribbons of smoke curled up out of the shadows as the dragon waited and watched for the young wizard to show himself again. Jack smiled down at the wretched eyes glaring up dimly out of the darkness. With his wizard's cape half burnt, he could still feel the heat of the dragon's fiery breath on his back, and knew he had narrowly escaped with his life. Then, with a wave of his hand, Jack turned and flung the terrace doors open wide. Once inside, they slammed shut behind him as he threw off his smoldering cape and went to his war table. There he found his maps strewn across its surface, with a wooden goblet perched at the edge of the table. Jack quickly guzzled down its contents, then tossed the cup aside, and peered down at the numerous scrolls, ready to devise another plan to meet the beast in battle. He rummaged through the maps, flinging them here and there, when one of them happened to flip through the air and land at the feet of a dark, foreboding figure, standing in the shadows across the room. The giant of a man was clad from head to toe in polished black armor. The dark soldier held a grim mace in his clenched fist and stared straight ahead. Amazingly, the enormous black knight was a perfect replica of the miniature toy Jack had in real life, only this one was 8 feet tall, weighed a ton, and could actually talk.
"How goes the battle?"
echoed the deep voice from within the heavy armor, like a giant in a cave. Jack looked up and grinned at his dark companion. "It was close, real close. He nearly got me," Jack said excitedly, with sweat still dripping down his brow. "I flew under the bridge, and he followed me into the dark, just like I knew he would. That's when I hit him with a lightning bolt, then slipped on a rock. When he came at me, there was so much fire I didn't think I was going to make it. He got my cape, see?" Jack pointed to the cloak still smoldering on the floor.
"Yes,"
said the Black Knight.
"You are most fortunate, sire. The dragon is swift for his size. He will be difficult to defeat."
"Not if I can get him where I want him," Jack said, as he unrolled one of his maps and pointed at the stream indicated below the castle. "Here, see?" The Black Knight tilted his head down, with a noisy creak from his metal collar. His voice was slow and ponderous.
"Ah, yes, of course, the element of water. Dragons of the air hate the water. A brilliant strategy,"
he said, as Jack began to formulate his plan. "If I can just get him into the deeper part of the stream." Jack paused to look around. "Where are the other maps? The water charts?" Jack quickly leafed through the maps on the table, then stood up sharply. "I know. They're in the cabinet," he said, and whirled around so fast he didn't see the big man standing directly behind him and slammed into him like a brick wall. Jack hit the floor hard and laid there for a few seconds, then propped himself up and shook his head to clear the cobwebs. "Hey!" was all he could think to say, as he stared up at the solemn figure. Stadia looked down as the boy slowly climbed to his feet, with the towering Black Knight standing in the shadows. The angel gave him a cautious glance. The massive soldier was easily a foot taller and armed for battle. Jack rubbed his head. "How'd you get in here?" he said with a frown.
"Come with me,"
the angel commanded. "Hey, I'm a wizard, you know," Jack whined as he dusted himself off. Stadia glanced at the Black Knight again.
"Listen to me. This is all an illusion. You are living in a dream. You have no powers. Now do as I say. Time is short. We must go,"
he said. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Jack said and scowled, waiting for some response as Stadia walked past and never looked back.
"I'm afraid your life depends upon it,"
he said, and sounded like he meant it. It was a threat that made Jack pause to reconsider. "My life? Hey, who are you?" A wispy cloud appeared at the center of the room. The angel marched forward defiantly, then without a word, disappeared into the misty realm of the Norworld. Jack watched him go, then turned to the Black Knight in a fluster and spoke as though he was late to catch a train. Okay, listen. If I'm not back in 1 hour, you come and find me, all right?" he said. But the suit of armor remained silent and gave no response. With that, Jack chased after the angel. Wait for me!" he yelled, then ran into the churning vapor and vanished from his dream and the castle chamber.